And Deepak, who works a lot in pain field, pain medication, we share a common interest on the neuroscience, the neuroimmunology field, i.e., the interaction between the nervous system and the immune system, and that whole dynamic and that whole balance.
My view on a lot of things around emotions, around pain, around everything that we discuss and what we feel is all still relational and in context to the environment and the society and the habitat around us. The cultural influences, the societal changes, everything matters and everything is in context. So my background is as a pain physician. My work is predominantly within the NHS as a consultant in pain medicine. I work in Berkshire, which is probably relatively a mix of more affluent, but then there are pockets of deprived neighborhoods in the towns that I am part of, which is West Berkshire, and the biggest towns for many of you from and around the UK would be towns like Reading and Newbury, Wokingham, and you've got the really, really affluent places of Henley-on-Thames and Ascot just next door at the doorstep. But you've got then pockets of extreme deprivation in parts of Newbury and in parts of Reading, which have their challenges. So that means in my pain clinic within the Royal Berkshire Hospital, I get to see patients with this overlap of pain and a variety of emotional dysregulation and mental health illnesses on the background of a variety of chronic health conditions and places where now we realize there is so much of the environment that we spoke about this morning, the physical aspects there, the change in spirit, the identity and who they are. All of that makes a difference in how people think about themselves, look after themselves, and interact with society and community, and their context changes. So that's kind of the background to what I see in my clinic. And from a medical perspective, I've been trained within an inch of my life for the last 30 years across two continents because I trained in India as well. Is very much what we now call as a biomedical view, that it's only about the physical and only a little bit more about the chemical, but the environment or the spirit is not really being called into question. It's not really been taught to 90% of medical professionals or healthcare professionals, I'd venture to say. And for a lot of us in the room who also have a healthcare background, and for a lot of healthcare professionals now in the UK post COVID, we are making our own journeys and finding our own paths to bringing in the spirit, to bringing in those elements of context which we did not get taught in our healthcare professional schools. So I think that's the journey I'm on right now for the last 5 to 8 years in discovering and learning and reading about everything that I hadn't been taught. And one of the things which you mentioned about, Neil, is this overlap of the nervous system, which is where my work normally existed in pain and anesthesia, to this immune system, which we now know is deeply interlinked. And can you believe until the early 2000s, and even now most of teaching is that there is no connection between the brain and the immune system. The brain was considered to be an immune privileged organ, meaning that it had no role to play in immunity, that there's this blood brain barrier which just separated everything and the brain just did its stuff. And we now know that that's so not true at all, that the neuroimmune system is so deeply linked. Plus, it gets influenced by the endocrine system. And that has an element that reflects in our beliefs, in our manifestations of behavior, which is how the field of psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology, scientists love to make it as long as possible. Something that makes it difficult to roll off most people's mouths there. But yes, so that's the field that I'm now interested in learning in and doing about. And that's where I think understanding about how stress gets modulated, what's the role of that in emotion and pain, and fundamentally for me, is pain a sensation, which is what I was taught? Because if it's a sensation, then that lends itself to the traditional view that you can identify where that sensation is coming from. You can block it, you can numb it, you can cut it. And that's how most surgeries have evolved for pain management. That's how any of us in this room, when we get pain, we think there should be a scan that finds it and a drug that sorts it and an injection that kills it or relieves it or a surgery that resolves it. And why pain is the biggest problem in modern world right now with 1.5 billion people struggling with it. But what if pain was an emotion? And that's the evidence that's coming out now. Because then if pain is an emotion, then like every other emotion that we discussed about, how do you go about identifying it? How do you go about linking in with the other emotions that we all face? And how do you then go about calming down the systems of safety, survival, autonomic? That opens up opportunities for us to be looking at supporting our patients better. But that also opens up challenges because that goes in direct contradiction with what's available to the patient in our existing system. And I think this is where calming down the emotional system, calming down the autonomic system, calming down what we think is contributing to stress and the confluence. That's where I'm so interested in the habitat and the environment that our patients come from. Because if I don't know that history, the relational elements, then I cannot make sense of what techniques will work for them and what they understand has relevant to their stressors, because each person's stressors or changes to their emotions will be things I'll have to change. So that's where my thoughts are, and I want to probably bring in everybody else in the room and Damon's views on that element of stress there. So probably that's part of one part of what I think answered your question. The second part of unpacking, I have just conveniently forgotten.
That's all right. No, the other part I was sort of talking about and touching on in a way is how the thoughts that we have can have a massive impact on the outcome of, and actually, as you were talking, I was actually thinking to myself, pain is to a degree an outcome. It's an outcome of something. And in some cases, you have to define and decide pain. There is a evolutionary primitive reason for why we have pain, and we need it. But then that becomes, when it becomes from acute to chronic, the outcome, the pain outcome, you have to then think through how did it become an outcome? Where did it come from to generate that pain? So if you're saying emotions are involved, which they are without a doubt, and let's say also there is a major psychological component involved, and the pain is the outcome, is there something you can do therefore to reverse that whole process that would alter the outcome? So therefore, you think differently, you feel differently, your emotions are different, and you have no pain because of the whole process. So you've reversed the process of changing your way of thinking. If your thinking can create the pain, i.e. the outcome, surely your thinking has the potential to reverse it.
That is really where now the cutting edge of exciting research is happening, Neil. And just to put it in context now, the last 10, 15 years of pain in itself, the research says, is that pain, exactly as you said, Neil, is an emergent property. It is a opinion of the brain when it has perceived what it considers to be a threat to its survival or the safety of the organism. So we've kind of divided it by saying there's something called nociception, which is a chemical reaction that happens when you sustain an injury. There are chemicals released at the site of that injury, and that injury by itself does not mean pain. That's just an injury. That's chemicals getting released, and they are getting converted into electrical activity by the nerves that are picking up the signal, the sensory perception. But that signal will travel to the brain. And we used to get taught in medical school that there are pain pathways, that there are pain receptors, and then there is a pain center which makes decisions, or rather, which it then executes a movement to pull your hand or your leg away and protect your leg or arm from the injury. We now have a slightly more complicated way of thinking about it. What we are actually now discovering, and the way to think about it, is called predictive processing. The brain has already got a model of what it should respond to various signals that are coming from different parts of itself, whether that's the skin, whether that's the inside, which is the gut and the information from the microbes, whether that's the outside as it sees from the eyes, or what it hears or it feels. All of those are just signals. Signals by themselves do not mean anything at all, not in the least pain. But when these signals arrive at the brain has already got a model previously of what to do when certain signals come. So 95% of the plan to protect you is already there. When this signal arrives, it's got to decide, does this signal resemble anything that it has previously had? So therefore, the first step is to say that the brain has had to have a lot of past experiences, past context, past cultural thoughts, cultural norms about what pain is, what danger is, what survival is, what safety is. And it's already got all this locked away and created into these models. So when the signal comes, it says, have I experienced this before? In what context have I experienced it before? And in that context, what did I do? Did I cry? Did I move away? Did I protect myself? Did I shut down? Did I run away? Or did I just think it's nice and accept it? And that output, if it decides it's got to protect the body, the organism, it will then have a algorithm that will fall out, which might be pull the leg away, squint your face, express an emotion, shout loud, because in that context in society, if shouting loud gets you the help, then it would do that. If it's keeping quiet and running away, it would do that. If it is just accept it and flop, it would do that. But it's all a sequence of emotions and sensory output that's all emergence. That's the way we now think about what would happen when pain occurs. And the same thing. So the same pain, and they've done some really good experiments on bondage, on people who go to experience pain, but in a pleasurable way. The signaling is the same, but in one, it's painful for someone who thinks that bondage is bad. But for someone else to whom it's pleasure, they go to seek it out. It's the same nociception, but the emotion, the pain, and the response is very much dictated by what we do.
It's fascinating. What you're, what I'm thinking through as well is the possibilities, therefore, that something in the past, in your experience, trauma related, can then be a miscommunication as well to the brain, and then the brain can perceive things wrongly. If the immune system gets the wrong messages from the brain, that it thinks it's got to do something, because the brain feels as if it's been attacked for some reason, Therefore, it sends a message to the immune system to say, the immune system, guys, we need you to kick in. It then can cause an imbalance in the whole immune system. And that unbalancing of the immune system plays out in many different types of illnesses until we redress the balance. We help to retrain that, using the sense of neuroplasticity that we know is possible in the brain. We have that potential to be able to shift that movement, but that then connects actually to a degree with Graham's work and what he was talking about. There's an energy driver that needs to come in place for that neuroplasticity to happen. It doesn't just happen on its own, because there are people, without them, we wouldn't have the concept of neuroplasticity. For example, Christopher Reeve is the one that comes to mind for me immediately. He had a major back injury, became a tetraplegic.
Yeah.
But something within him drove him to a point where he was getting some feelings back, and demonstrated that there is a power, an energy that was within him to enable that. So it's all very well saying the brain can do these. The brain, for me, is a processing piece of machinery. It's there, you need it, but there's an energy driver that also sits underneath and needs to be engaged. And that is something which we need to see happening more and more. We need to hear from people who've had an experience where they feel there's been an energy within them that has driven that.
I suppose what I wanted just to ask you both, maybe, I'm so interested in this kind of bottom up, so what our body's feeling, and then these predictive models that we have based on our lived experience. And I work, part of my job, I work with people who have functional neurological disorders, so this is really relevant. Part of the research I did was on agency, the importance of that part of the brain where we feel a sense of control of your own situation, and how that helps with pain outcomes, but also in terms of how that part of the brain, when we feel some form of control and agency, it's so interconnected with other parts of the brain and is very neuroplastic. And the evidence, the research coming through from hospitals actually, where people lose a sense of agency, and how that impacts the neuroimmunology, I suppose, and symptoms and outcomes.
There are two parts to that query there. I think the first part, probably I'll just go back to what Neil was saying there. Neil, you're absolutely right. And where I was leading up to is, with all these predictive models of where pain is going, is to say all of these gives us the opportunity to say that now there are other ways to reverse what the brain has got into. If we think that chronic pain, for example, is a output that is slightly flawed of the brain, because the brain has got stuck in this overprotective, oversensitive cycle of saying, I need to run off this algorithm all the time because that's what's protected me 10 years ago or 3 years ago. Then part of the retraining and the neuroplasticity is actually just giving that updated model of safety to the brain. And that's what new studies like pain reprocessing therapy in the US is showing, that you can actually completely reverse chronic pain to the extent that the person becomes pain-free. That's what the studies are showing, that you can do that. What they're actually doing in the microscopic level is what probably, once the brain and the nervous system understands that it is safe, its direction to the immune system is to now say, well, things are safe now. Let's engage with everything that we've done. And that's where I think the principles of what we do in lifestyle health, the attention to diet and nutrition, because that's the internal immune system modulation, attention to physical activity, movement, attention to mindful practices and stress management and autonomic reduction techniques. I think that's where all the evidence is pointing now. Sleep optimization, all of that really makes a difference. And I think Damon's really going to expand on those aspects there a lot more there. But in relation to what you were saying and you were asking, in some ways, that's the part we haven't cracked effectively in healthcare. For those who have low agency, or rather what we perceive as relatively low agency, what should we be putting into the system to give them that agency and control? How should we make them feel? How should we make our patients feel empowered? Those of us here, those of all of you here who've had that lived experience and changed your lives, that's what I'm curious on, as to what are the steps that happened in your life for you to feel I have the agency to take control and do this for myself and go about and do it, because that's something that's a secret sauce that I do not know how we can then scale it to other patients and say, these are the things you'd likely to do. That's where enhancing neuroplasticity, creating the environmental conditions for neuroplasticity to occur, I think that's still a black box. There are lots of ideas, and I'd love to hear that. I saw quite a few hands.
Lynn.
Damon's going to have, Sam's going to have, Lynn was going to have. So I think that's where I'm curious to see what the options are.
Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure to come today, because it's not only going to help me long term, and hopefully I can help you.